I can hear the howling wind and feel the rain tonight. Every drop a prophet in your name tonight. Oh, and the song that they sing.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Sermon Follow-Up Video. My name is Pastor Dave. I'm the lead pastor here at Faith Christian Fellowship. And we were able this past week to hear a great message in our Jonah series by Pastor Kyle Brennan, our community's discipleship pastor here at Faith Christian Fellowship. And I'm going to ask Pastor Kyle to come and join us and to answer a few questions about the sermon. Pastor Kyle, how you doing?
Good. How you doing?
Great to have you. What a great message it was on Sunday. I've heard a lot of great feedback, especially on a topic that I think is dear to our hearts as followers of Christ, and that is how God uses storms in the lives of his people. And we saw in verses 4 through 6 how it says that the Lord hurls a storm at Jonah in order to get him to turn back to him. And so we saw that the intervention of God in Jonah's life was actually through a storm. And a couple of the questions that I think as we consider that passage that come up is, how do you, when you think about the storms of life that we face as Christians, why do you think we struggle so much seeing the storms in our lives actually from the hands of God? And I think we get when storms happen, but we don't like the fact that they actually can come from the hand of God, like in Jonah's case. Why do you think we struggle with that so much?
Yeah, I think part of it is we want to bring God down to our level and think that he thinks the way we do, and think that he acts the way that we do, and thinks that he plans things the way that we do. And we try to put him in a box that we fit in and try to mold him to be the kind of God that we partly can understand and partly that we like. And so when we see storms, and if you look at the three storms, or the storms we looked at from the three angles this week, first being from the sailors who don't know God at all, didn't know they were specifically running from him. It was just kind of, they were doing their thing. And this storm comes in. To them, there's nothing good about it in the moment. And then with Jonah, there's some similarities, and certainly with the disciples on the boat with Jesus. In the moment, it's terrible. It's scary. It's frightening. They can't see beyond the storm. And we do that with storms in our lives. We just see the difficulties and the problems, and we can't see beyond it. And if it was up to us, right, we wouldn't do that. So we often think of it either as a punishment, or maybe God has lost control, or maybe more often for me, it's that, do you even care that this is happening to me, kind of thing, which is what the disciples, of course, do. So we have trouble viewing these storms as from God, because God doesn't act like us, and we want him to do what we want him to do. And he's not so much worried about how smooth the ride is, right? He's more worried with the destination and where he's taking us. And these storms are a tool in our life that he uses. And we don't want that. We don't want to see that. We don't want to look at it that way. So I think that's a big part of why we have a difficulty seeing them as coming from God.
No, what a great answer. And I love the correlation that you made in the different scenes of the movie of Jonah's life, from the sailor's point of view, Jonah's point of view, and then looking at the storm with the disciples and Jesus. And I love the fact they say, do you even care? Which is kind of what you see Jonah wrestling with. Does God really even care what he thinks and feels? And then, of course, you see Jesus on the boat saying, peace be still. And I love that you pointed out that here is the master of the wind and the waves who actually is allowing this storm to happen. So the one who has authority over the storm, there's nothing that comes into our lives, storms or not, that isn't first filtered through the hands of God, that God doesn't give some ability for. And Job is a prime example of that in suffering, that God actually gave Satan permission. And that's a whole other topic, but nonetheless, it's something we wrestle with. And you're right, we don't see God, we see God in the way we want to see God, instead of seeing him for what the scripture reveals him to be, and that he is over all of these things and is able in the midst of them to draw glory to himself and even the growth of our good. I want to follow up with that, because I think one of the things that you hit on, but obviously in a sermon it's hard to go deeper on, is this idea that Jonah finds himself in the midst of the storm, asleep in the belly of the boat. And I just wondered how how is that indicative of our lives when storms come? When you look at human reaction, how does it correlate with Jonah sleeping in the belly of the boat? Because it is pretty eye-opening to think. Here he is asleep. These sailors are professionals, and they're scared to death. Exceedingly afraid is the word that's used in the scripture. And here's Jonah, who's not a sailor. He's a prophet, and he's asleep. Mm-hmm. What do you think about the correlation with that and the way we respond to storms?
That's a great question, and I alluded to it a little bit, but like I said, I didn't really get into it too much. Part of it, I think, the storm that was raging within Jonah, I think it was all encompassing. It was taking over every bit of what he was doing, his whole experience. And so the storm above really became background noise, and it was almost like not a big deal because the storm that he was dealing with within was much bigger. And it's like that in life when we start facing these storms, things that used to bother us or used to really kind of drain us, they fade off because they're not as big a deal. And sometimes that's good, but sometimes that's bad. It all depends on how we react to it and if we're going to trust God through it or not. But so with Jonah, I think like a lot of us, when storms come raging in and we don't think to hand it over to God, or we don't take the time to wrestle that through and to tell God how we feel about it and to tell him how difficult it is and to cling closer to him intentionally, it drains us and it's tiring and it's difficult and it's supposed to be that way, which is why we're supposed to be drawn to Christ and to give him that burden. And to take his yoke. And so I think in many ways, Jonah was carrying this whole burden alone. And he wasn't supposed to be carrying it alone. And it wore him out, and he was tired. And what happens after, when we go through a large emotional experience or just craziness that we're not ready for, or not able to handle on our own, the first thing I want to do is go take a nap. I just want to go to sleep and shut the world off and escape from it all. And I think that's a lot of what Jonah was doing. And I think it's telling also that while he was running from God, he didn't lose sleep. He sought it all the more and went. And it's all part of that whole thing of where if I can escape this, if I'm asleep, I don't have to think about it. And the storm that's raging above is nothing compared to the storm that's raging within, and it wore him out. I think that there's some parallels there.
Yeah, no, that's powerful, and I think. I always think when the going gets tough, many people go take a nap, and in this case, I think you see that in the life of Jonah, and what a great observation about the sleep that here he is the storm in his life inside of him, and he's able to sleep, and he's just sleeping it off. And how many of us do that? We run and we say, I'm just going to go take a nap, I'm going to go sleep, I'm going to go sleep it off, and what we're really hoping is it just passes. It just passes, and for Jonah, it's just beginning. This is just the beginning of the story. I want to turn now to one more item, and that's this idea of the sovereignty of God. We're seeing that through the book of Jonah. I mean, we're going to run into the idea that God is sovereign. Can you kind of describe to us the sovereignty of God a bit? And then, the application of that, especially in the realm of the storms of life as well. Yeah,
that's a big topic. That's sermon series after sermon series and follow-up video after follow-up video. But I think, obviously, the sovereignty of God, is speaking towards his complete control, his complete. He orchestrates it. He's never caught off guard. I mentioned a little bit talking about in Mark where Jesus is in the boat and he wakes up, wondering what was his first thought when he woke up. Is he thinking, oh, why am I being woken up, or what are you guys doing? More likely, he was right. He thought right on cue. This storm was one that he knew was coming, and he was in charge of it from the get-go. He didn't have to just go deal with the storm that he wasn't ready for. Yeah. It was orchestrated by him and for this purpose. And we see that all throughout the New Testament. Jesus, when Lazarus dies, he says, we're going to wait. We're not going to go there right now. We're going to wait. And then when he gets there after he's been dead for 4 days, 3 or 4 days, he says, guys, this happens so that God can be glorified. And that ties into the whole sovereignty of God. It's all part of his plan in that sense. And so with Jonah, the storm in many ways was brought on by Jonah's disobedience and Jonah's desire to run. But God is still in control of that, and God allowed him to go so far. He was on a leash, and he let that leash go out a certain amount. And we don't know how far that leash is in each situation, and sometimes we don't get as far as we think we will, and sometimes we wish we hadn't gotten as far as we do, and all that stuff. It all kind of weaves into God's sovereignty. But the sovereignty that we see in this story, the sailors, we'll see as this series continues that the sailors are, through this storm and through what they see and through, watching what happens to Jonah and the storm stopping and all this, they are drawn to God, and they realize this God is real, and this God is to be feared, and the power that he has is no joke. And so through that storm, it draws them near to him. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't an afterthought. That wasn't a happy side effect to the storm. That was all part of his plan. And then obviously the same is true with Jonah, and that, we're going to see he gets swallowed by a fish. That fish wasn't an afterthought. In fact, the fish that got him was, I believe, designed specifically for that moment, and that's all part of his sovereignty. And then again in Mark, where the disciples come up, it was all part of the plan to show us and display his sovereignty and power and greatness over that. And I think that's so crucial when we're going through the storms to recognize God's sovereignty. And if we don't, I think we're really stripping God from not just misunderstanding the power that he holds, but we're stripping him from his glory that he is due when we say, oh, well, God's not really in charge of that, or this is, an afterthought. And it just makes it so much easier to me knowing that no matter how dire the situation is, he is still sovereign.
Yeah.
And it wasn't an accident or an afterthought.
Yeah, I've stood beside the dying bedside of people, or the bedside of dying people, and in that moment, it is the most freeing doctrine, is to know that God is sovereign. And sovereignty doesn't mean that God does everything, but that God knows everything, and that he is intimately involved in the affairs of our lives. Not that God is up there doing everything that we see around the world, but that God knows about it and is at work in it, even in those moments we don't see. And I think Jonah is a prime picture of that, where he is, and in this case, intentionally involved in it, even in those things that maybe it looks like it's not in his hand, but it is. And I think, some thoughts as we close. First of all, running from God is exhausting. Running from God is exhausting. Sin is exhausting. It'll cause you just to want to sleep. Instead of running to him, you'll keep running away from him. And we want to encourage, if you're running from God, realize he is in a relentless pursuit to intervene in your lives. He is a God of intervention. The cross is the greatest picture of that. And we hope that if you're here and you don't know Christ, or you're listening to this and maybe you know Christ, but you're running, he is going to intervene. It's who he is. It's who God is. Thanks for listening this week. We look forward to Sunday. We're going to be continuing our series through the book of Jonah, and this is going to be a great series. We're excited about it. Thanks, Pastor Kyle.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Appreciate it.